Hello, QVS U.S. History students. I hope you're having a good weekend, and I wanted to take the opportunity today to commend you on your hard work from Essential Unit 3. I also wanted to talk to you today about the A-level activity for Essential Unit 3 and 4. If you read my email last week, you saw that the A-level for these two units is one project that you can engage in with one of your classmates. And you could say to me, but we live so far away. But I would say to you, that doesn't matter, because with technology, we can do so much. And I would encourage you to work collectively with someone in the course to do the A-level activity for Essential Unit 3 and 4. And I will take you to that activity and show you around. I also will email you an example of one of the students from last year and the project that they created, a couple students from last year, I should say, and the projects that they created for Essential Unit 3 and 4. As you saw in the last unit, we spent a significant amount of time talking about American expansion and how the United States came to control all of the land that they control today, or at least with the contiguous 48 states. And we also looked at how the country was torn apart because of expansion and the expansion of the institution of slavery. You took a look at Reconstruction, and it's really on that notion of Reconstruction, which is the cornerstone of the A-level activity for these two units. But I include it with the Unit 4 because Unit 4 covers the period from 1870 to 1900. So much of the Reconstruction that took place immediately after the U.S. Civil War ended in 1865 impacted the time period that we are about to explore within the context of Essential Unit 4. So let me go to the course page. Let me show you around and talk about what you need to do in week 1 of Essential Unit 4. And then, like I said, by the time I get to the end of this instructional video, I will have taken you to the A-level activity assignment for the two units so that we can kind of quickly go over what my expectations are for that project for Unit 3 and 4. Okay, so let's go to the course page. There we go. And let me take you down to Unit 4. I just opened it up. And you can see that Unit 4 is going to run for 4 weeks, so you have a little bit longer this time. But I do want you to start thinking about the A-level project right now, because it's not like something that you could do effectively in just 1 night or 2 nights, especially if you're going to work from afar. But essentially the unit that we are looking at in Unit 4, it's called Migration and Industrialization, and the time period goes from 1877 until 1900. So a shorter time period from the unit before, but much happened within the context of it. You can see that the map that I chose for this unit concentrates on the American West. So just because the United States gained all of that territory doesn't mean that those lands were immediately organized into states. I mean, many of the lands were uninhabited by European Americans. Those lands were inhabited by Native Americans. And you can see by looking at this map, the territorial losses that the American Indians endured between 1850 and 1890 as a result of American expansion. So in 1862, the president at the time, during the Civil War, signed what was called the Homestead Act. And essentially, the U.S. government offered large tracts of land, like 160-acre tracts of land, for anyone who was willing to move out west and settle that land. It was of the government's interest to relieve some of the population density of the East, and also to have people move and settle and really make the land productive. So the country offered this, But as Americans were moving west, Native Americans were pushed further and further off their land. So what you're going to see in week 1 of this unit, our focus will be on what happened to the Native Americans as a result of American expansion. The last battle that took place between the Native Americans and the American forces who pushed to protect the land for American settlers was at a place called Wounded Knee. You could see it right here. If you look at it on the map right here in South Dakota. It was a very bloody battle, but it ended, it marked the end of the wars against the Native Americans. And then what famous historian said, Frederick Turner Jackson, the end of the frontier. So you'll actually be looking at that concept of what constituted the frontier and how the American frontier throughout its history was continually moving further and further west. It kind of connects with that idea in the last unit that you all looked at with Manifest Destiny, that notion that O'Sullivan had coined back in the 1830s, that it was the Americans' destiny to move west, to settle that land and make it progressive and productive. And we can kind of get into a whole debate over what constitutes progress, but in either case, they moved out west and it ended up impacting the Native American peoples in a very negative way. And you'll take a look at that in week 1. So let me take you down. So so you can see it's for 4 weeks. So we'll be working through mid-December. And hopefully you get this unit done before the winter break so that you can relax over the winter break. But of course, you're welcome to use that time if you want to take it a little bit slower. I will let you work within the context of winter break. Here are all of the resources that you need for this unit. There are textbook chapters. And then finally, I'm going to kind of get you down to week 1. In week 1, the first activity that you're going to be doing is just going back to that whole idea of westward expansion. Again, I know we looked at this in Unit 3, but more and more Americans pushed to the west, and you'll learn about some of the challenges that they faced as they moved out west. The land was very different. The climate was different. So in terms of farming, they found that they had some more difficulties that they had to contend with. They had to learn the land so that they could be more productive in terms of farming. Farming became mechanized during the industrial age that took place in the period that we are going to look at. And that created a lot of difficulties for farmers who owned smaller tracts of land and who were not mechanized. So we begin to see the impact of industrialization on farming. These are some of the challenges that you'll be presented with within the context of that first activity called westward expansion. And then the next few activities that we are going to be looking at largely impacted the Native Americans. So I'm going to kind of scroll back up to the map, but I'll talk about the Dawes Act and Native American boarding schools and the other activities that you're going to do this week. So essentially what the Dawes Act did in the 1880s was it had broken up the reservations. So the reservations were a practice that had been created beginning with the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Perhaps you remember him from the earlier unit. Andrew Jackson was the president who was responsible for that period in history called the Trail of Tears. Essentially, he moved out the 5 civilized tribes from the American Southeast and promised them this land in what is present-day Oklahoma right here. And you can see it even is in green. And it says American Indian Reservations as of 1890. So he promised them out this land out there. They put the Native Americans on reserves. There's still a lot of Native American reservations that exist in the United States today. And in doing so, Andrew Jackson said they could have the land as long as grass grows and water runs. And it's interesting because those two things still happen today, yet a lot of the land that had been promised under the reservation system has since been taken away. And that was largely done through the Dawes Act. or it's also called the General Allotment Act. Essentially, what they did was it was a piece of government legislation that aimed to break up the reservations and assimilate Native Americans. And then moving into that next activity, part of the assimilation process had to do with taking Native American children away from their families and sending them to boarding schools in the East. One of the most famous boarding schools was called the Carlisle School, led by a general. His name was Pratt, and he's most famous for his phrase that he would save the man but kill the Indian. So the whole idea there was really take away the Native American culture and replace it with American culture. Many would refer to this as cultural genocide. So Native American children were taken and put in boarding schools, and within the context of the activity this week, you'll take a look at the transformation of the young people as they lived on these boarding schools for much of their youth. And when they went back home to their families, they were unrecognizable to them. You'll even hear some 20th century stories about that, because the boarding school system for the Native Americans lasted well into the 20th century. So that will be the focus for this week. And then you're going to end the week by looking at two other groups of people. The first one, they're called the Exodusters. So after the Civil War, you know, there were a significant population of African Americans who were freed from slavery, and they were living in the American South. And many of them ended up staying there. However, as you learned in the Reconstruction activity in the last unit, those who stayed faced a lot of violence and backlash from Americans who fought with the Confederate forces and lost. So a number of African Americans left the South and moved out west, namely here to Kansas. And those African Americans who left the South and moved out west were called exodusters. It's a biblical term, a mass migration to the west in this case, and they became farmers. And then that takes me to the last activity for this week, farmers and the challenges that they faced as the country began to industrialize. A movement began to occur to collectivize farmers called the populist movement. It even transformed into a political party that fought for the rights of farmers on the political scene. So that's what I want you to do for week one. And then I told you I'm going to take you to the A-level activity and briefly explain to you what you need to do here. You know, think about Donald Trump. Think about Joe Biden. When they became president, they each had this slogan. Like Trump's slogan was "Make America Great Again." And Biden's slogan is build better, bigger, better. I want you to essentially do something like that. The country just pulled out of a devastating war, and you have to create a political and economic plan for the country to make it better, to reunify it. So I would encourage you to read through these instructions here so that you get a strong understanding of some of the problems under the big idea. And then I've outlined your goal right here. And as I said, you can work in a team. I mean, you can completely do this on your own, but I would encourage you to work with someone else. And in doing this, you have to make a presentation. Now, I suggest Powtoons. It's a fun like video creator that you both could work with remotely. But you could also like do a Google Slides presentation. However, that'll be a little bit more difficult when presenting. And in doing so, you have to present to me a plan for how the country is going to be brought back together, reunified, peacefully, because under the Reconstruction plans that existed back then, there was no peace. Political deals were made, and violence ensued, and Jim Crow took over these segregationist policies. You need to build a better plan.